I work in Trinity now. We have about 13,000 students. In the early 80s, we had about 2,000. And that's pretty much typical, I think, of most universities. They've shot up their numbers. And it's a policy drive as well on the part of government to increase the number of people with doctorates, at the same time as they're reducing the amount of funding that they're giving to universities. So they haven't quite thought that one through particularly well. So it's an interesting area to be in, and it's a skill that you can do some things from books, but usually it's from people. And I think the only thing I would say, or want to say, and the burden of what I'm saying, is that it's not just a case of doing the thesis. I think as you're doing it, I think it's really important to watch how you work. That, I think, is the lasting benefit that you take from it. If you've done anything like it, you already have an idea of how you work. But it's an exercise in many respects like no other. So how do you actually work? And so I very often would encourage students that I have about 9 students under my direction, and I tell them to keep a journal, as well as the notes and all of that sort of thing, just to keep a journal of what have they been doing at the end of a week, what's really, sparked for them. Because if there isn't something sparking, after a while it just becomes turgid, and it really does become quite hard to keep the thing going, because you all have other things that are going and that you need to give attention to, and this becomes a cruel business if you're not enthusiastic about it. So certainly the mentoring that comes from a supervisor is important insofar as they show you and help highlight how it is you work. One thing I learned before I went to university, and it is something that I'm now trying to work with students who are coming in. I passed through the stages of my primary and secondary education without actually learning how to study. I ended up with a leaving certificate entering college, but it was only when I resat my leaving certificate, which would be the equivalent of the A-level in the UK, that I actually learned how to study. And I learned how to study because I enrolled to resit my leaving certificate with a correspondence college. And this was a new experience, because up until then I was used to studying in a classroom with other people around me, and you took your cues from the dynamic in a classroom, or you took your cue from what seemed to be animating the teacher, or what seemed to be animating peer group. And suddenly you don't have any of that. You just get the sound of this thing landing on your doormat once every 3 weeks or so, telling you, ta-da, here are your handouts. Read this, read that, read the other, do these assignments, return it. And there's no classmates, and there's no teacher. And that was where I began to learn actually what studying was. And partly I learned through simply following precise instructions, because there were no social cues to read. But also I went into a bookshop and picked up a book called How to Study, which I hadn't really thought that you needed to do. And it was the opening of the seventh seal. It was marvelous. It was really a terribly helpful book. And one of the things it said was, well, invest heavily in filing equipment. This is studying. I didn't think investing heavily in filing with this. This is a pre-computer age, I hasten to add. This is, wow. Investing heavily in stationery, filing, all that stuff's really important. If you don't have a desk for your research, buy a desk for your research. Do not let anybody else near it. This can be really popular if you're working at home. As you suddenly sort of lug a desk in and say, and nobody's touching this. So this idea of giving space and time and priority to it in very basic things. This was all new to me. And I noticed that as I began to do that and give it that kind of space and priority, it became a much more enjoyable thing and a much more manageable thing. And a thing that, because you were doing it in an organized fashion, from start of business until close of business, you didn't have that angst at about 8:30 in the evening thinking, I should really keep going for another couple of hours here. Now, I hasten to add, because I was a scholarship student, it was a very artificial environment. I had been given resources, a room, and I was told, you have 3 years. Write about something you'd like to write about. You know, I didn't have to pay the kinds of bills that other people had until I was in my 4th year, was I needed it. You know, it was wonderful. And it's a luxury that not everybody has, and you don't have this. I mean, and as you mentioned, you have a 3-month-old who, they eat things, you know. Even though they can't eat, they eat things. They love paper. They really love paper. I used to be handing back essays to students who were doing correspondence courses with me, which would always, my older boy always managed to get at them no matter where we put them. You know, they always went home with lovely crayon drawings of smiley faces and things. And what fun. Anyway, it's a big task doing research. That's the first thing I would want to say. And anyone who is dealing with you knows that it's really, 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 really a big thing that you're doing. The first quotation I put up there, the question, why should we subsidize intellectual curiosity? Date might be a bit of a giveaway. Who said that? Very close. Similar kind of agenda. Different country.
Reagan?
Bang on. Yes. That was Mr. Reagan as part of his campaign.
The Z, shouldn't I?
Yeah. Well, that was probably me, or my typing correction. And it's a very curious phrase, this phrase of intellectual curiosity, the idea that people who are working, it was particularly targeting humanities at the time, that Reagan saw these people in the universities as largely time wasters who were indulging in their own sense of curiosity. And why should the state supervise that kind of activity? And it seemed to be a popular way of talking about research at the time. Certainly Thatcher was quite capable of saying exactly the same thing. But since then, we've seen what we now have this strange phrase, curiosity-led research has become almost in revenge for Reagan saying curiosity is a sort of an idle thing for people to play with if they want to. It's now become a thing, as they say. And certainly Gordon Brown, both as Chancellor and Prime Minister here, was very much a champion of curiosity-led research, as were most of the professional bodies, because they said, rather than telling us what we should research, we don't really produce good stuff. If we're genuinely curious and follow the probings of curiosity, that's when we've actually made good discoveries. That's when we do good research. It's when it is actually rooted in curiosity. So, in a sense, the research climate in which we're all working at the minute has had two things that have happened to it, I think, that are really, really helpful. The first is that curiosity is not necessarily seen by the people with the purse strings as a bad idea. It's seen as potentially very good and very helpful. And secondly, we've seen a widening of the notion of impact. That if you look at something like the British Research Institute for the Humanities and look at how they define impact, because they obviously have a certain responsibility around funding research, that they can't just say, well, do anything and here's money. They have to define impact. But we've seen in the last 2 to 3 decades a real change around what they think the impact of research is and why they're prepared to reward research. That impact is now being broadened very, very much, so that things like action research, research into how communities receive ideas, research into how people can make their lives better, research into how something like the interrogation of ancient texts can be taken up and received within a community. All of these are now seen as socially valuable and valued impacts. And that's quite a good thing, for people who are researching that. For a long time, we had a very negative stranglehold from some of the hard sciences, which other sciences struggled with as well. Genetics used to be really upset at the way it was being sort of outfunded by cruder models of how you do science. But in the way now, for us who are broadly speaking within the humanities spectrum, there's also a broadening. humanities is now being accepted as something that has a social benefit, that human beings have ways of being that need to be studied, need to be appreciated, and that it is possible to have discoveries that have impact. So it's in a sense, this is just the broader climate that's important. That's the question of why would anyone do this? Well, they do it because they've curiosity, and they want to satisfy the curiosity that they have, and they think that their curiosity is not just about getting a PhD, which is your passport to teaching in the university, but because what you produce on the way will have a value that can be passed on, that can be given on, and people can learn from it. How do you do research? Not just in the sense of how do you do it, in terms of sort of locking yourself in a room and reading books. This is what I've said before about journaling. It's not just, and this is why I'm focusing more on form rather than the content of research. Most people, when they're doing research for a thesis, get bogged down in the content. I mean, I can spout on and on and on and on and on about liberal Protestantism and Catholic modernism, and I could start now and you could come back in 3 days and I'd still be going, just feed me from time to time. I know the content. What really matters in research and why supervision works, if it works well, is where you've been given attention to the form of your research. How do you work as a researcher? Part of that is determined by the field you're working in. If you're a case study person, that gives you a certain framework within which to work. There's good and bad practice within framework. And it's not good enough just simply to go and do case studies. You have to think, sit back and work out how you're going to do it. What is best practice? How do you go about observing what is best practice? If you're working on texts, what is good practice within the guild that you're working in? What is considered an acceptable practice? You were saying, Tim, you're doing something that's sort of practical theology. What is good practice in that area? And it's not just to demonstrate it in the thesis, it's for yourself. That there has to be a way in which you resource your work as a researcher, because that's, in a sense, your professional skill that you're going to take from this, that when you go and do your next project, something else will transfer from it, whatever that project is. And in terms of devising what you're going to do in your thesis, at the planning stage, if anyone's at the initial stages of work, focusing on form rather than on content is really, really important. Because I think when you are researching, and there is a kind of an isolation, as I've said, that comes from research, because the idea, after you've done your research, is that you're the expert on this thing. So that carries with it an isolation. The number of people that you can talk about your thesis to and find reassuring nods begins to reduce. If not entirely evaporate. So that the form is the important question. One of the exercises we do, and you have to, in a sense, translate this according to taste, but when you've got a group of students who are going to, I teach a couple of courses at master's level, right? So you go in and you say, right, these are the learning outcomes that we have to hit for this particular module. And this is the course description. And you ask the class, how would you assess the course in order to see if these outcomes have been met? And they begin to start devising maybe essay topics or project works or portfolios of work that they would have to do in order to satisfy those conditions. And at the end of the day, you're trying to say, you have a very good wide-ranging discussion about what level should they be aiming at masters. So we end up getting the level they should be going at, the kind of things they should be able to demonstrate, and then you get them to translate that into essay questions that would actually assess these things at this level, as well as some criteria as to what the examiner should be looking for. And at the end of that session, they will have produced the essays that you're going to set them, although they've set them for themselves. And at an early stage in research, you can do more or less the same for a thesis topic. That if you're going to study the reception of a thinker called Professor A in a context called B, you can ask people to, in terms of form, what do you need to show to satisfy doctrinal doctoral standards at this level? What do you need to demonstrate? What sort of sources do you need to get at? What sort of on-the-ground sources do you need to look at? What kind of methods should you show that you're competent at using? You can do it entirely informally, and at the end of the day, you will begin to see the structure of a thesis emerging in terms of what are the, if you like, the boxes that you need to tick in terms of form. And then you, in your research, can supply the content that fits those particular boxes. Because 90% of us in our research, the thesis will be assessed in terms of form rather than content. But we will be more worked up about the content because that's what we were actually digging into for those years. And does it hold together as an argument? That's really the important question. So I think beginning to chew over the form of the process and asking yourself, what do I have to satisfy in order to reach doctoral standard? And if I am doing this topic, how does this topic get translated into a thesis? That's quite important. And what I said there about embedding methodology, I'm slightly scared of methodology because I have some colleagues who are very keen on methodology, and they can talk about methodology almost as much as I can talk about modernism. And at the end of the day, you still feel like you're asking them, but what do you do? That you can have, I have a theory of methodology in relation to this and a methodology in relation to that. And you feel, well, at some point you're going to have to say or do something rather than tell us about your methodology. In its crudest form, methodology, as we look for it as an examiner, is we're looking to see that the student knows that they've had that form discussion with themselves or their supervisory team, and that they know what conditions they have to satisfy in their work. They know what methods are appropriate, and during the course of the thesis, they will embed those issues in their discussion, so that the reader is taken by the hand and shown, I am now going to do this, and I'm going to do it in the following way, and I'm doing it for the following reasons. That there is an element of critical and self-critical awareness about the procedure of the thesis, that you don't simply bring the argument along. It's not a very nice thing to say, but I tend to tell students that the ideal examiner that you bear in mind is somebody who's well-meaning but a little bit dim, and that you need to explain your every move to them, because as you write, it's incredibly obvious to you what you're doing and why, because you're living with the darn thing. But this will have simply landed on somebody's doormat with an almighty wallop at some point, with a little letter saying, please read this and report back. They haven't had that living with experience. They're simply going to read from point A to point B, and they will spot if there isn't an obvious connection in your argument. Now, sometimes there won't be a seamless argument. I mean, there is a point in method where you will simply say, there are different ways in which we could now go into chapter 3. We could take this approach, but the limits are such and such. We could take that approach and the limits are such and such. And we could take the third approach where the limits are such and such. And in the interest of time, space, and the finitude of life, I am going to go with option 2 because they just want to know that you know what you're doing and that you've made a choice, that you haven't presumed that there is an inevitability about the way you are going to research the topic. Presumptive inevitability is something your examiner will watch for, that you have assumed, yeah?
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure, please do. Chip in, yeah. Yes.
I suppose it depends on your supervisor or the people who compose your viva voce. So you'll get various answers to this question. When you write your paper, your thesis, in a somewhat seamless way, arguing smoothly from beginning to end, are they more concerned that what you're saying has been proven, or that what you are saying has been demonstrated with a seamless argument?
Good
What are you
question.
concerned about in their minds?
Yeah.
What are they looking for?
A lot depends on the examiner. A lot depends on the examiner. The examiners I've had the pleasure of working with have tended to be more interested in students who, well, they tend to value the students who realize that the seamlessness is their work and that there are other ways this could be construed, and who have signaled that if there was life enough for all of us, we might have gone down other routes. There's a kind of an arbitrariness, ultimately, about the approach and the topic you take for your research. And I think an awareness of that is always a good thing, because one of the things I would always encourage students to do in their conclusion is not simply to reiterate, which is, I mean, you can't break new ground in a conclusion. You can only say, this is what I've done, this is what I've concluded. But you can say, on the basis of my years reading this material, you know, were I to start again, I might focus more effort on such and such a field or such and such an aspect of it. That's acceptable, because it signals to your examiner that very few things are seamless in terms of argumentation. And they may, in a viva, for example, take you up if this thing is so knocked down that you think there is only one way in which this topic can be approached, and there's only one method by which it can be unpacked, and there is only one conclusion you can draw. You can bet your bottom dollar that's what they will be testing in the viva. I suppose it depends how suspicious their mind is, you know, but most of them will be suspicious of too much coherence, because, as you know, as soon as you pick up two commentaries on Luke, you're dealing with two people who possibly shouldn't be invited to the same party, or certainly not if there's sharp cutlery available to them, you know. So that kind of emphasis is important, I think. But
what if it's a new field? For instance, where a lot of research has been done, so your work is pioneer in nature, you're cutting a path through a woods that's never been cut down before, so they don't have, the examiner, they may not have a pool from which to draw to evaluate.
Well, I think most of us who've tried to do anything that's even vaguely pioneering, you know, we have our little Ecclesiastes moment and we think, you know, there is nothing new under the sun, so where is this anticipated? That you can kick the ball in the direction of familiarity, that you don't simply have to say, I am outrageously new and therefore cannot, you know, please don't assess me by existing criteria or whatever. I mean, I think that's something that you have to watch for. I mean, I think one of the difficulties, I suppose, of doctoral research is that it is supposed to produce something that is original. But originality is something that is horribly overstated. And you know, there is nothing worse than picking up a thesis from somebody which says, you know, this is my thesis is entirely original because no one has ever dealt with this material in this way at all, ever. Because that's just dragging the coat for you to jump on, really, you know. Originality, I think there's two ways I would say most people get at originality. One is by maybe picking up a theorist or theory that hasn't been applied to a particular field before, and perhaps as, you know, therefore there is some new light to be shone on something. There is a new approach to be taken on it. And sometimes it's through combining fields that haven't previously been brought together. And then you can have a methodological quandary as to whether you're being multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. But I find that examiners tend to respond well to quite modest claims for originality thus far, because I think it shows, I mean, it's one of the disorientating features about research is that the more you get into it, two things happen, I think. One is that your thesis ends up, if it's going well, it ends up becoming terribly simple in a way, because it's obvious to you what you're doing, and you're concentrating on a closer and closer, more and more focused field. On the other hand, you begin to question the very ability of you to be original on this, because you're constantly dipping into other commentators, other sources, other people who've dipped into it, even tangentially. So you have a sense that where you're going, other people have trodden a lot. And that's a healthy thing. It does give a certain level of modesty about the kind of engagement you can bring to it. So it becomes kind of simpler, because in a way, the thesis you're arguing, or the question you're answering, the more you're doing it, the more obvious it becomes to you. That's what we're doing. And that brings a certain simplicity. But the fact that you're also reading literature that is so incredibly irrelevant and bears in on what you're doing, and may even comment explicitly on it, that brings you a certain level of focus.
Can I just,
Right, yeah.
just ask about how you would distinguish interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary? And from my point of view, I perceive that I am drawing on both patristics and historical elements, but wanting to take that into doctrine. I've never really reflected on what is the nature of trying to draw those two disciplines together. How would you describe it?
Yeah. It was a question first raised for me about 3 years ago. I just used to use the terms interchangeably and then realised that they're not, because multidisciplinary work is work that draws on a variety of different disciplines. But when you start working in an interdisciplinary way, you're actually integrating the methods and approaches of different disciplines. It's potentially much messier, because whilst there may be methodological overlaps about how certain fields proceed, there's also ways in which they don't necessarily overlap. One of the things that's very curious when you're working if you do any work at all in patristics, is that you sometimes find yourself drawing on a range of authors who write in relation to classics. And they seem to have a very conservative way of reading history. There's a very trusting relationship between what they think the text says and the historical reality behind it. Once you get into the people who are writing on something like the Apostolic Fathers, or even the scriptural texts themselves, you're suddenly into a whole range of much more critical theories of interpretation around what was the aim of these texts originally, how have they somehow or other skewed the events behind it, or have they reflected them correctly? And, it's quite an interesting, it is an interdisciplinary experience, because I don't think as somebody who's comparing, say, scripture and patristics, you can't just borrow what Professor of Classics says and shove him in beside what Professor of New Testament says. Because they're answering to different concerns. And in a sense, that has to be addressed at a methodological level.
Yeah, I think that's certainly flagged up for me as something to dwell on. The whole sort of conflict between history and theology that you touched on this morning is there as well, because there is a sort of false objectivity that gets applied to the historical study of the Church Fathers. But at every turn you've got theological implications.
Oh yes.
And that's something that spirals out of the 2nd century and immediately into the 21st. And that's something to keep a watch on for me, because effectively I'm seeking to do the very same. I'm seeking to be as objective as I can be to a point.
Yes.
And then to make that leap into a different method, which is having established a hermeneutic for Irenaeus in my case, to then work that hermeneutic as hard as I can to get a new perspective on his theology. So
yes.
It is a risky method, I think.
It is.
But it's also quite exciting to be on that kind of teetering on the cliff edge, as it were.
Yeah, and I think very often in areas like historical theology, you have this, a lot of what your attention is being done, and it's also the case with a lot of contextual theology, where a great deal of what you're doing initially, at any rate, is trying to get some kind of adequate description of, what the literature is, or, what he was like historically. There's a kind of a positivism that you want to get a good description, but then you become more explicitly normative, because I'm presuming that you're not just going to say, here is a slide showing Irenaeus with his doctrine of sin. and we all applaud politely, what a lovely doctrine of sin he had, I'm assuming you're going to say that there is something in this that doesn't just stay with Irenaeus, that manages to, maybe even reach up onto us today. So that transition from description to normativity is something that theologians particularly have to wrestle with, I think. That, and again, it's if you're doing some sort of case study, that, it's not just a case of, here is a description of how this church works. Or, in particular in your case, here is a conflict.
Can I just pick up on that then, in terms of mine? I'm just slightly fudging in my mind between form and methodology. Judging from your title there, methodology gets to the form. So in my case, just to put it simply, I'm doing congregational research, which will largely be qualitative interviews. So if that's my methodology, that's my methodology?
Yes, yes.
What is the form to which that methodology points?
Okay.
You see where I'm learning to where one...
Yeah. Well, I suppose, strip it back to... there's a kind of an artificiality in saying distinguish between form and content, because you can't sort of separate them. You can only distinguish them to some extent. But you're doing a case study, isn't that it? So, and are you seeking to demonstrate anything at the end of the study, or are you waiting on findings in order to see what you're going to demonstrate?
Well, even that question, I'm not sure. It may come out a bit more this afternoon. But I've got, let's say, a hunch that to use a narrative critical form of interpretation will engender a more life-transforming response to sermons rather than just a mental kind of learning.
Okay.
Getting into the story,
okay.
feeling the feelings and things. So that's my hunch. So I'm hoping, otherwise it could be 5 years of kind of not wasting time, but not getting where I hope to. I'm hoping that by doing a case study and using congregational research, my kind of longing, not academically, as a minister, will be that I've kind of, in a case study form, proven in this setting that there is some good evidence from the congregation that what my hunch was about will be vindicated.
Right.
So I'm not sure of the outcome in that sense because it's the research, but I have got the hunch that I would like to find out and became the conclusions and the methodology.
Okay. So I would say, if I was trying to tease that out in terms of simply sort of trying to remove the content off the board, I'd be thinking to myself, right, okay, you want to test a hypothesis around how preaching can transform a particular situation.
Yeah.
You want to test that hypothesis in a specific context.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that are going on there. Now, some people, I don't know what is, I think we have to sort of go back to our psychiatrists on this and ask us why it is that some of us want to ask research questions and some of us want to argue cases or test hypotheses. There's something, some people incline more naturally to one than the other. But let's say we're testing a hypothesis here, which is that this kind of preaching has this kind of impact in this kind of context. Then we need to see what are the ingredients of that formally. There needs to be an account given of what this kind of transformative preaching would be made up of. We need to have some idea, some notion of what that means. We have to have some idea of to what extent that is differentiated from other forms of preaching. Sort of dreadful preaching. We have to have some way, though, of saying, well, this is what is distinctive about this. And these are the ways in which we can assess, or what are the ways in which you can assess the impact of preaching? What are the methods by which you can assess it? What criteria are you going to employ? Because if you want to test the hypothesis, there has to be a way in which you can say, well, this scores 4 out of 10 or 5 out of 10, and therefore it doesn't get past the pass. What is a successful rate of, getting feedback from your case study that says, well, are you going to investigate people in terms of hands up if you've been transformed lately? Or are you actually going to engage in sort of more in-depth interview by which you will be endeavoring to see what notions of transformation that you supply these people meet? So that's the kind of thing I mean by form, in terms of what are the step-by-step procedures that, if your thesis is about testing a hypothesis, what steps need to be there? What disciplines do you need to show competence in? What kinds of procedural guards do you put in to show that these steps in the argument have been followed? So that at the end of the day, you have a reasonably good flow between your original hypothesis, an account of how you tested it, and a sense of what the results are and what they highlight for you. And that's what I really mean by form. That we haven't gone near the content of preaching, we haven't gone near what criteria, but just that there are criteria, that there must be something testable, that when you're going to the congregation and saying, what's going on here? A colleague of mine who writes on evangelicals in Belfast, Gladys Gagniel, she's a social scientist, is her baby, and she does a research module for us called, what does she call it? I think Research Methods for Social Transformation. I might try and get some slides and send them over to Joshua, and he could sort of share them with you, because her work is really interesting on this, and she has done work with congregations in Zimbabwe to see to what extent their life and practice is reflecting bigger themes. So she's had that question in her mind as to how do you test for, what's going on at a big level in terms of individual responses within a congregation. So that might be something that you would find useful, or maybe some others would. Any other thoughts on this? Yes?
Thank you. How much of a difference do you see between two words? Quote, I am demonstrating thus and so, or I am proving thus and so. Or I am arguing, or I am suggesting, which is a word frequently found in papers.
Yes. Well, I'm suggesting doesn't really cut much with me, to be honest, because you can suggest anything. I'm happier with demonstrating or arguing, because that does describe what you are doing. To say that I am proving puts you in the position of the examiner, in a way. They will tell you whether you've proved it or not. You could possibly hope to prove, but I would steer clear of it, because I think that's part of the modesty of research, that you don't necessarily prove it. And part of what I'm saying, it's the very bottom thing here. Somewhere along the line, towards the end, when you've got your first draft, you need to pick up a large brick and whack yourself on the head and try and have some sort of personality change, because you need to turn from being the writer and the researcher who's actively engaged in working the thing out to having a different relationship with the text, where you have to become your own reader and editor at the end. And it's a very artificial process. Now, some people are capable of editing as they write. Most of us aren't. I discovered, as I was redoing my thesis, that I had put I'd written my paragraphs back to front, because I was working through it. And one of the ways I know I work with a pen in my hand. I don't think up here first and then gush it all down in its finished form. I start writing, and I think with the pen, and I realize after I've written 5 words, this is rubbish, and I start again, and the bin fills up very quickly. But I had written my paragraphs backwards, because that was the way I was working my way through the argument. But for me to present it to a reader, it needed to go the other way. I needed to start with where I'd found myself and say, and this is the situation as it presents itself to us, and here's how it presents itself to us. And then you do that paragraph, and you work on to the next paragraph and discover, I've done it again, and off I went. So, I spent my final recension was quite dramatic, because I was reversing my paragraphs. because there is a different relationship between you as a writer finding your way to your conclusion and presenting that material to somebody who's got to follow it in a different way. And it's a cruel business. And, the most, it's a bit messianic, but, nobody hath love for another man but that he lay down his time for him and do his proofreading. You really need to lay on a lot of friends who are going to, find your most retentive friends and hand them your text, and in the end, accept the fact that the text you will hand in, as soon as you hand it in, you will spot a howler somewhere. Just, don't get too, but this is an interesting transition, and as much time as you can for that point, because texts are infinitely improved as they move from first to second to third draft, possibly, and yet, as a researcher, you feel the first draft is the great accomplishment because you've done all the work on the content. That's where you've done your work and you feel great. And then this thing chips in and you start trying to produce something. And I want to say something. This is wonderful. This is a guide to what it is to be a theology student. It's a very cruel guide. This is a counsel of perfection from the 19th century historian Harnack, when he was telling students what they should know as theology students if they wanted to be really theology students and not just specialists. I think he took the view that any fool could be a specialist, but to be a theology student, you had to hold in equilibrium three competing sets. You had to know the field that you were doing your research in, obviously. But it was expected of any theologian worthy of their salt, according to Harnack, that you should be up in patristics. You'd be glad to know that. He chose well. but the debates around Christological, pneumatological, the origins of orthodoxy, because Harnack felt, and I think possibly rightly, that very often in doctrinal theology we find ourselves circling around those 5 centuries, that there is really nothing new under the sun. Moltmann rather peculiarly began his Christology by saying, I'm not doing the patristic period because it comes from an alien world, blah, 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 blah. And he obviously hasn't watched television recently, We're just as weird as the Neoplatonists any day, So there's very often, I think, nothing new has been under the sun since then in doctrinal terms. We've just used different names for it, and we've the period of, do you know Prestige's book? G.L. Prestige wrote a magnificent book called Fathers and Heretics. It's a very early 20th century book on patristics. It's great fun. It's a very good read, I think. I think early generations of students used to call it dads and cads for short. But fathers and heretics, and the fun thing was, of course, that some of the people who were fathers were also obviously heretics, because the boundaries hadn't become as inflexible as they've become later. So it's a wonderful immersion into a field that sounds very familiar, actually, when you begin to see what they're saying. So know that period, and then his sense is know what's going on that's simply at present, not as going on at present, which seems a bit strange. Going on at present. So he was into the idea that you should, read a journal. Keep reading journals. A similar notion on perspective I remember getting from Alec Vidler, who was a great English church historian. And Vidler told students as soon as they finished their primary degree, they had to adopt a book of the Bible and follow what the scholarly literature did with it. Just to stay with it. Yes, Azar.
It's interesting, isn't it, also, when you mentioned about the dialogues between East and West. But actually, for the Middle Eastern people, as I'm studying history, I think we're still living in the shadow and the results of the 5 centuries, especially the Chalcedon and the Ephesian Council. The big schism for the West is the 11th century. But for us, it was it was like scattered all the churches, and many even argued that this was the basis of the spread of Islam, because Christians were divided. They were against each other, even the Roman Empire were against all these Christians, and they helped Muslims to come over or so is still living in the shadow of what happened there in the 5th century.
Yeah, I think that's really true and very important. I mean, and it's funny that, I mean, a couple of years ago, Rowan Williams wrote his book Arius, which is one, and it's kind of funny because it's a historical book about Arius and the heresy and the response, and it's one of the best books on the theology of the Trinity ever written, because you can't actually make sense of that period without dealing with the legacy, doctrinally speaking. And Williams, of course, his doctorate was on the Eastern churches, and he was very much involved in dialogue with so-called Monophysite Christians. So in one sense, the agenda has moved on. In another way, we continue to circle around it, and it's part of, I suppose, what he would have said, and what Harnack said, and Rowan would too, is that we take our position in a historically formed discipline. We can't know it all. But one of the things I suppose we're all wrestling with in church, state, everywhere, is there are all sorts of interesting losses of memory going on within our traditions. And very often when things blow up in our face as churches, it's because we forget we've actually been here before. And that going back to the origins, I think, is important. So that was Harnack's suggestion, and Vidler's idea was slightly more manageable, keep up. I tried to do that when I finished my first degree. I decided that I was going to adopt the letter to the Hebrews, and I spent an inordinate amount of time reading commentaries and sitting there trying to translate passages all by myself as a way of spending the time. I'm not sure if it's a good idea, but I think certainly immersing yourself in a text is a good one as a way of making this kind of broader perspective. This is, I think, the thing I really do want to leave with you, in a sense. What I've said about form and trying to design your project in terms of form, this distinction between field and project is vital. And any of the doctoral students that I've seen coming unstuck have tended to be students for whom this distinction has been a problem. As you do research, you choose the field that you want to contribute to. It might be, broadly speaking, practical theology. It might be New Testament. It might be political theology. Now, that's the area that you're going to contribute to. And areas tend to be quite big. And therefore, by definition, you cannot produce a PhD on an area. Now, applicants coming into our university are very often asked to sort of write a brief research plan of what they plan to do. 9 times out of 10, their plan is about the area they want to contribute to and not the project, the precise project that they have in mind. So you'll get somebody saying, well, I want to write about the theology of God, and I'm particularly interested in God and the world. And you cry when you see this application coming in, because this is this is somebody with the beginnings of an alcohol dependency issue.
How many lifetimes?
Yeah. Whereas if you've got someone who has a clear idea, my interest is in the field of homiletics, I'm going to devise a project that will contribute to the field of homiletics. Projects have lifespans. They're designed, if they're designed well, they have a lifespan. For most people in the doctoral world, it's somewhere between 4 and 5 years, say. And the thing that makes a project really work is at the very beginning, you have an idea of what the end of the project will look like. That you're not going to have a Mrs. Thatcher project which intends to go on and on and on and on, as she once magnificently said. You want to get out. So that end point has to be designed from the beginning. And the people who really run into the sand in their research projects very often have no idea at what point they are going to have reached the end of the project. The project has a beginning. It has an interminable middle and no sense of an ending. And that really is, it sounds very basic, but that's one of the areas now where I would see people coming croppers. And it does mean a certain level of, is it masochism or sadism, to know that the end is nigh and we need to stop now. I think it's harder in the humanities, because our friends in the sciences do their 2.5 years of lab work and then write it up. And that's grand. I mean, you just say what you've done for the last 2.5 years and send it in. You can't do that. That's not what you do. There's no writing it up for your kind of research. You write as you go. And therefore it's harder to know at what point the end has been reached. And there will always be more. There will always be more. And that's why I say at your conclusion, it can be a healthy sign to say, I know there's more. I'm not going to do it because, you know, we have finitude on one hand and research on the other. So a field can last a lifetime. A project is begun when it's with its days numbered. You design its end. Built-in obsolescence is terribly important with a project. And as I say, that is a very bland statement, but it's one of the things I would say that's trying to get that across to people is vital. Now, here's something that I'm finding very peculiar in research methods for us, in the way we teach. For research methods for the masters, we have 4 pieces of work. They produce what we call a research portfolio. The first is we do a bit of formative assessment. It's not assessed, but it's designed to show people a little bit of how they do their work. One thing we do is we get them to write a précis of quite a complicated chapter. Précis writing has become a much neglected skill. I think the only people who do it are the barristers, and that's why they're paid so much, you know. But being able to take something complex and reduce it into 1,500 of your own words is an extraordinarily important skill. And very often, if I'm supervising someone who is focusing on a particular author, who maybe have written sort of 5 or 6 volumes, I will get them to write a précis of each one of those major volumes, so that we actually have already got them one step back from those sources, that they have these works in their words. And we also get them to take notes on another text, just to show us how it is they take notes. Some people write out very detailed notes. Some people have, you know, a card index system. Some people will send you a computer file as the way they do their notes. Other people go bananas with highlighters on a photocopy. There's no one way in which you take notes. But we ask them to take an idea, take some idea of how long does it take them to do these tasks. And we would try and assess this in the group, or sort of discuss it in the group. And it is curious to see that what one person has highlighted in, you know, repulsive yellow and lots of underlining in red, another student has sort of sailed happily past. It didn't sort of get them. So they get into a conversation about why they're pulling certain things out and why they're not. And they begin to become a little bit aware of what you say there, the hermeneutic that's guiding them, because that's guiding how they're doing it. And you'll see that one student has taken half an hour to take notes on a text. Another student, possibly more honest, is saying it took them 2.5 hours. One student handed in her précis, and instead of, you know, it took me 3 hours, the whole bloody weekend. Excellent, because that's a bit of honesty. And it also shows that if you are going to wrestle with complex texts, you need time. Because certainly in the course of a master's course, it can be a little bit overly tempting to think, well, you know, I've got from May until August to do the reading. And you think, actually, no, you don't. You know, if you're reading honestly, if you're taking notes, if you're giving yourself time to digest it inwardly, it takes time. It really does. And the sooner they know that at the beginning of their course, actually, the better. When it comes to the assessed part of the course for them, we get them to write a literature review as part of a course proposal. And this, each year, seems to become more and more of a headache. it is the point where we see tears. You know, it is the point where tempers fray, which I find a little curious. I'm not quite sure why the literature review and the thesis proposal should manage to engender quite so much angst, but it does. So I don't know what your experience of doing this is, but I think in many respects a literature review is one of the most important preliminary tasks that you can do. In a sense, you'll produce one maybe as part of research methods or something to satisfy your supervisory panel, but you'll keep amending it as time goes on because literature, bless it, continues to be published. But what you're doing in producing a literature review, and particularly if you're combining areas, whether in a multi or inter way, is you're actually defining what the field of study is. You're saying to your reader, if you want to study this field, you must know this literature. This is the representative body of literature that defines this area of study. How you lay it out, of course, is your own concern. Some people will say, well, here are historically significant classic texts. Here are, if it's a more recent one, it might just be journal entries, articles. But you're doing two things. You're defining the field. You're assessing the field. Smith is very good on these things, Jones, however, blah, blah, blah. And you're claiming that space for yourself. So it becomes almost a mandatory part of an introduction to have this kind of review of the literature, because it's not just a case of saying these are important books. It's saying here are the key architects of the field to which I intend to contribute with this project. And they have left me a gap. So the originality question is being addressed here. That I have something to say on this, which is not necessarily being addressed in it. So it addresses the form question by doing that, but it also produces a huge amount of content issue. Because when you sort of become at the other end of the food chain and you're reading theses for examination, and somebody hands in a thesis, you can sometimes find that they've actually done a very good literature review in the sense that they have got the right authors, but they've been extraordinarily slipshod in handling them. They've jumped through this hoop much too quickly. And it's one of the earliest places the examiner will have a chance to get to grips with what sort of reader are you? Have you actually read Professor Smith's work fairly? Or have you decided that Professor Smith is going to be your whipping boy for the rest of the thesis? So there, your readers will be looking to see that you are a competent interpreter, that you are an honest interpreter, that you're not actually presenting Professor Smith in the worst light possible, in fact, possibly even misrepresenting Professor Smith to give yourself a little place to cling in. That you're critical, but you're also self-critical, that you've some sense not only that these guys have hermeneutical things going on in their minds, but so do you, and you can be upfront about that. And one of the first professor of theology I had was a great New Testament scholar, and the virtue he looked for in students was he called it flexibility. He said, if a student has inhabited the field and has done that dynamic of being both critical and self-critical, they're capable of being flexible with the material. They can move from one genre to another. They can move from one kind of argumentation to another. They know they're doing it, and you know that they know that they're doing it, that there is an authority that's there, and that's what you want from a piece of work that is intended to be a masterpiece in the medieval sense. I've put around that book on research methods. These are three books that I use with enthusiasm for the students I teach. I know it's setting the bar a little bit low to simply look forward to surviving your dissertation, but I think that's a really good book, and I think the fact that it's managed to get into its third edition is probably a good sign. In general, I think most people who write books on research methods write the same stuff over and over and over again, some more accessible, some less accessible. In the humanities, we're probably more concerned with qualitative rather than quantitative research. But I think that Shelwoodstone and Newton book is very, very good. And I think that the chapter on writing, they've actually got a professional writer to write about writing, rather than somebody from a purely academic point of view saying, well, you have to write stuff. Here is somebody who's slightly more aware of what they're doing when they write. Because that's very often the point where people really experience pain. I personally hate writing. Well, I would love it if I would be left in a room on my own with my books. But that is not, however, the way that life treats most of us. We have to grab hours here and there. People get blocked. People get perfectionist. And it is really helpful to have somebody who is a professional writer take you by the hand a little bit and say, it's okay, These are ways in which you can get yourself going. Diana Ridley's The Literature Review, I think that's, again, very useful because it's an essential part of any research proposal. Has to have that kind of comprehensive but not exhaustive account of what makes your field the way it is. And it's the first, as I say, it's the first thing your examiner is probably going to pick up. Usually with taught masters, we end up looking at we look up the bibliographies first and look at their conclusions. When I'm talking to other people who mark at master's level, that seems to be the way we've done it, is to see, well, who have they read? And what do they think? Grand, now I'll read the rest of it. Usually, I think with PhDs, people start at the very beginning and start into, well, what has this person been reading? And is this the kind of stuff they should be reading in order to address what's in the title? And if they don't feel that that's a comprehensive or if that's a coherent mix, so much the worse, really. And the final book there I put there is Mary Waters' Write an Effective Funding Application. I think that's a really helpful little book. It is a little book as well, which makes it even more helpful. It is also available for Kindle, which makes it really, really nice. It's a super resource because all of us end up having to write all sorts of things for our sponsors. So how you do that without selling your soul along the way is terribly, terribly important. But she is passionate that you as researchers in writing proposals should be passionate about your research and should convey that. Because I think, again, it's one of the hangovers we sometimes have in the humanities that we try to sound dispassionate. We try to sound as though this is the most obviously relevant thing in the world. And we try and cut back on our involvement in a desire to see this area researched and brought to a wider level of attention. So I think that level of encouragement is something terribly attractive. So that's really all I wanted to say. I mean, the key things for me when I'm talking to students, I mean, as I say, when I'm sitting down to meet a new research student, I have a couple of sermons that we go through. One is, distinguishing between the area and the project and trying to explain that even though it's very dull and they have a clear idea, or so they think, of what they want to do, that we will spend the first year probably getting that plan absolutely watertight, or as absolutely watertight as you can in a field of research. That, I think, is really important. And getting people into writing the first thing that they can write, and I think the soonest piece of working that most people are able to write is something like a literature review, because you can do it as a rolling project, as opposed to, having to weigh and evaluate and then contribute a chapter. I think you can start working on what are you doing in any event. And the old form and content question as to what boxes need to be ticked for this to work as a thesis. If you get that right, then all you've got to do is supply the content that fits the boxes. The boxes will fit together, and it will be obvious what function chapter 1 has in the thesis and what function chapter 2 has in the thesis. And if you can get that kind of distance from it, I think it can be quite helpful, because the rest of the time you are swimming in content, and you need to get some way of putting it in a way that makes the obviousness of why you've done it clear to your reader. Any thoughts?
I noticed they're all written simultaneously, year by year. Isn't that interesting? 2007, 8, and 9.
Yes.
What gives?
I wonder when it was I started teaching research methods. Yes.
I think the distinction of field and project is very, very helpful. I think this is one of the main things.
Okay.
Yeah, because I myself teach business methods.
Okay.
I think, it confuses many people. Because if you don't realize that, it's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a cruel thing, if people haven't quite got the level of precision around the project. One of the old directors of the School of Ecumenics used to try and sort of smile at people when they were getting more and more worked up about their project. And he would say, it's only a thesis, which they were quite likely to kill him for saying. But I mean, he wanted to distinguish between this is a part of your professional development, and you will go on to do other things. And there's a kind of a mourning that goes with letting go of a thesis, and you can see some people have an unhealthy desire to protract it as long as possible. But if they've got it as a project, I think that helps make it manageable. Because, theses and projects can sort of romp across your mind and take over. And, I didn't say it in this, and I was going to. One of the... you can't really talk about research methods as though you just performed clinically like a machine. We've had a situation in college where we've had noticeable levels of mental ill health among students, particularly in the area of theology and biblical studies. I'm not sure why this is. I think it's possibly because students who might line up to do this field sometimes come to it because they have a quest for meaning going on. And they a quest for meaning. They're looking for some way of addressing questions of meaning, and they find themselves in a less than therapeutic environment in a school of religions and theology, where instead of being supplied with meaning, they're actually being given questions that they have to address under exam conditions, which is not quite meaning, as it were. And we've had a lot to do. We've had very good interaction with our college services on this regard, simply because there is this question. But that's that's the undergrowth issue. The overgrowth issue is that for many people doing research, it's a very isolating activity, and you actually need to take positive steps to ensure that you see human beings, because otherwise, yourself. Research suddenly starts at 10 o'clock when you finally wrestled the children into bed or whatever, and you feel that normal people are now watching television, whereas you are turning on the computer and getting ready to grammar again. And that's isolating, it's tiring, and people need to watch out for themselves. This kind of solidarity is very good, but when you're away from it, it can be a problem, and you become aware that a lot of people who are doing research do struggle with the isolation that goes with it, and the fact that some of your best insights come when you're on your own and there's nobody else you can tell about, that you've just, I've had a eureka moment here, or if you tell somebody, they look at you as if, God love you, God love you. So, I do like the little pastoral guidance leaflet on the room that, sometimes your neighbour needs to be left alone, and sometimes you need to take them to the pub. So there is balance in all things. My one of the lecturers we had when he was in Trinity, he felt that Irish students needed to be taken out of the pub and put into the library. And then his next job was in Lund in Sweden. Yeah. And he said, it's entirely the reverse here, Yeah. We need to get them out of the library and into the pub. So you have to find a little bit of balance. But anyway, thank you very much. There's 10 minutes before lunch. If anyone wants to chat further, by all means. But otherwise, you've been awfully tolerant.